All right. Well, here we are for another episode of Breaking Changes. I'm pretty excited today to have Dekel Tankel from VMware. He is a founding member of Cloud Foundry and Global Field CTO at VMware. Welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Yeah, I'm. We a mutual friend connected us, and I once I just started hearing you talk about API gateways and management, I was like, all right, I got to do a show with this guy. So let's start with the basics. What does VMware do?
So VMware is striving to make multi-cloud a reality, which means helping build the applications of tomorrow on any infrastructure. So the company is now evolving to anything, any infrastructure, any workload, any cloud. So any is the word.
Nice. And as I'm learning the VMware landscape, there's several dimensions, and what you've done in your history. What is Cloud Foundry?
Yeah. So Cloud Foundry was originally started as an attempt to open source or to open in general this platform as a service landscape, which was very integrated or closed with solutions like Heroku. And we open sourced this on the same principles of developers should never care about the plumbing of the infrastructure and should be able to just push their codes into any environment and be super productive. And the idea behind Cloud Foundry is in the original launch, we had this triangle of you can plug in any development framework, any services, and run it on any infrastructure. And this was kind of the beginning of this open platforms era, but in a sense it was a little bit early because there wasn't really a multi-cloud. There was kind of one game in town at that time. But I think where we made a lot of headway and kind of how we reached the business growth that the company had is mostly around this developer experience and the fact that developers can really become 90% more productive by using this platform. They don't care about anything else. And their operators can trust this because it has all the security features they need.
Nice. So one more question to kind of zoom in and bring this even closer to APIs. What is Tanzu?
So as you probably know, VMware acquired Pivotal. So for me personally, it's kind of a full circle because Cloud Foundry was started at VMware, and then we spun out to Pivotal, had fun for 5-6 years, went IPO, and been very successful from a business standpoint. And VMware acquired us along with a few other companies on the infrastructure side with Heptio, on the observability side with Wavefront and others. And the goal, and that became Tanzu, which is kind of this brand name for all the technologies that kind of sits on top of the infrastructure layer to make modern applications a reality. So it's the developer experience, it's the DevSecOps experience, and it's the infrastructure experience of running Kubernetes. So that's in a nutshell, Tanzu is like, think about it as the Cloud Foundry 2.0 on a Kubernetes infrastructure with any cloud and on-prem, off-prem, with everything that comes around it.
Nice. Well, we'll dive into the details here in a little bit, but I usually like to get to know you, the person I'm interviewing, a little bit more before we dive into the technical details. So what's your story? How did you end up at VMware? You gave a little bit of it with the pivotal jump here, but How did you end up at VMware?
So my career is kind of upside down. I spent the majority of the first decade of my career in small startups, and the second decade in large enterprises. Usually it's kind of the opposite. So I had to worry if I'm going to have a paycheck next Monday in the beginning, not at the end of my career. So a bunch of different startups. I'm originally from Israel. I moved to the US also from a startup. Those startups were primarily on the infrastructure side and then a little bit on the platform side. At some point, I said, I got to look for something bigger. So I joined Yahoo. And like from a small Israeli startup to Yahoo, that was kind of an interesting transition and an interesting learning curve. And at Yahoo, I helped the making Hadoop accessible for developers. So that was kind of my first kind of engagement with public APIs that developers can use to access broad set of infrastructure. If you remember things like YDN, YQL, those were kind of under the I helped do some damage there, and also around Hadoop user group and so on. So it was kind of an interesting experience. Yahoo at the time was a company that changed a lot. So, fun and less fun at the same time.
Yeah, Yahoo's great. Yahoo lit a fire under my API imagination, the developer network, the query language.
Yeah.
So I think you probably had you're a little bit responsible for me getting into the API space. Thank you.
Well, guilty as charged. I think YDN, at least, the Yahoo Developer Network, was a really humbling lesson for me, what it means to have this tiny little API that you access, but on the back end, millions and millions of stuff need to happen. So it was kind of my first exposure to this enormous gap between the external interface and what happens underneath. And we're going to speak about it, I believe, later around the internal APIs, which is kind of what makes me excited, because you have like 4 or 5 external APIs, but you have thousands of internal APIs. And we were struggling with that even back then with YDN on there was no structure for these internal APIs. We didn't even call them APIs. It was APIs for the external stuff, right? So I think today organization realizes it's very different.
Yeah, no, we'll definitely get into kind of the details and nuance of all of that. So let's start with gateways, because I think some of the things you said in our previous conversations about not just the technology of gateways, but the business and politics of it, I found pretty interesting. So what's the role of an API gateway within the enterprise, would you say, in 2021?
Yeah, so I like to start answering these type of questions with a quote from Jerry Seinfeld, people are the worst. So, technology stuff is cool and fun, and we love it because we're techies. But at the end of the day, it's the politics and the internal organization structure that either make it happen or kill it before it has any chance to happen. And APIs are no different. The traditional role of gateways, if we can use the term traditional, is this was an operation game, right? Developers, although the name has application in it, aside from the acronym, it had nothing to do with the developers. They had no access to those giant centralized gateway. It was very gated and very closed, and it was an operational show, soup to nuts. I think that we see a tremendous shift in that approach, and the roles of the gateways are following up that change. And that change is driven by, I think, 2 or 3 major kind of shifts or push. So the first one is, how do you building microservices when you have 5 of them? That's awesome. When you have 500 of them, how your teams collaborate. What's the best way to actually build those complex applications and business applications and have dozens or maybe hundreds of microservices underneath them? What is the right contract between those development teams to make them productive? And we see for a couple of quarters now, maybe even years, that internal APIs are emerging as that standard. So the easiest and the most convenient way for developers to collaborate between those different microservices that are being built is those internal APIs. So that's kind of one thing, and we'll get to what the challenges of that in a second. The second thing is that the notion of, hey, let's rewrite 15 million lines of Java code for our legacy apps and make it modernized, that's maybe lucrative for the global SIs of the world, but in reality, it never happens. Too expensive, too hard to start, too much politics. And that's not how app modernization, to use another buzzword, is actually happening. And I see that every day. I talk to hundreds of customers and prospects of Tanzu. And there is a different approach that proves more efficient. And to use a term we use internally, it's not approved by anyone. It's not a marketing term. So just between us, brownfield APIs, which is like, how do you use internal APIs to access or to make the old and the new work well together. And so I think, and the third aspect of all of that is that along the lines of cloud native security, there is no way to kind of say, hey, let's create these gated environments that everything is secured and we're just adding more stuff to our firewall. You got to create a more dynamic and a more elastic way of changing the networks to follow that development lifecycle. And service mesh is kind of one of the things that we see out there. And how does that tie into API? We can also talk about that. So if you take all of that sounds great. But in a nutshell, it means that your API development and API delivery needs to be part of your software-defined lifecycle. And that's not what happens in a lot of cases that customers we talk to, specifically the ones that already adopted this massive centralized gateway. So they have this gigantic instance of Apogee or MuleSoft, and they have this kind of a set of operators that are guarding this with their lives. No developer can touch it. And now you expect a route change or an API change that's done between two development teams to be part of it. So you get this nice CI/CD cycles that takes maybe hours, and then you wait 3 weeks for an API route to be modified. So not really part of your CI or your software-defined lifecycle. So essentially, what we are does that resonate in terms of the?
Yeah, no, I would say that. I mean, that's exactly where I wanted to go. Is in a lot of organizations I work with at Postman, and even before Postman, is you go in and you talk to leadership, and they're like, what I ask them what their gateways are. Exactly what you said. They got Apogee, we got MuleSoft, we've got Mashery, Tibco, something in there. And I'm okay, great. And I go around and I talk to teams, and I'm like, all right, how do you get things into the gateway? And similar, CI/CD, the technical flow works pretty well, but the people flow is a blocker, is a gateway, or a gated, not even a gateway, a gate. And then they're like, well, we use Kong, or we use Tyke, or we use Nginx, or some other solution. And then when we have to, we publish up there. And then because of acquisitions, you'll see other even more gateways because of acquisitions. So it reflects what I'm seeing on the ground as well, as the role of a gateway. But what caught my ear when you described it is you're not just describing it in technical terms, you're describing it in business and political terms as well, which makes the old guard API gateway feel very much like the Oracle database of this next generation.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. And when we are thinking about this, we're actually thinking not in terms of gateways. Another internal term that I'll deny if you repeat, API grid, right? So we're kind of looking at this problem that is much bigger than the gateway, because the gateway is one link in that chain. And the chain has to, how do you make API first-class citizen in your software-defined lifecycle, in your pipelines, in your change management? How do you not take it out of the hands of the operation? That's not what I'm saying, but there is room for that external gateway, but there's got to be another set of solutions that addresses the fast-changing internal APIs and potentially also those few externals. But usually, when I go and talk to a customer, they have 4 or 5, maybe even one external API, and they have thousands of internal APIs. The one giant API has all the operation team hugging it like a tree and babysitting it like a pet. But the 5,000 internal APIs are cattle on the loose, right? It's not even cattle, it's herding cats. So that has to change because it means developers cannot collaborate. We talk to many developers that tells us they don't want to touch an API gateway ever again because the experience of making those changes with the tickets and fighting with IT and buying, what time zone are you going to broadcast this? Let's say Japan, Olympics, nice, buying sake to anyone in the organization to get ahead of the line, right? It doesn't work. So gateway is one piece. So here's what the kind of how I think we address this, and the early feedback is phenomenal, right? We see a lot of excitement from prospects talking about it, and I think it also can benefit tremendously the Postman community because at the end of the day, I think all of us are successful when developers love APIs, and developers don't kind of hate the notion of they're building APIs in secret until it's ready to be this one stable kind of giant thing. And I love your Oracle analogy because it's like we are shadowing small databases until we are ready to expose the schema to our DBA, and we kind of go, hey, can you please look at what I did here? So in that analogy, the small tables will be the internal APIs and the giant Oracle will be the external. But anyway, does that make sense? Like from where?
Yeah. So what are the biggest things that or the biggest areas of friction for developers when it comes to these API gatekeepers? We're not going to call them gateways because gateway would assume everything or things are allowed through the gate. And it feels like APIs aren't making out the door. They would have use, they would have value. Partners would use them. The applications would use them. They would probably benefit, but they're either not tested, secure, don't have the right policies. What are the things that are keeping developers in a kind of DevSecOps way from getting through these gatekeepers?
Yeah. So the first thing is the role, the fact that those internal APIs don't get exposed is not because the IT people are bad, right? It's because they are really not up to par with any standards. They are not, like you said, they're not secure. They don't follow any best practices, and it starts with. So when I mentioned the API grid is much more than a gateway, you kind of alluded to point number one. It's like, how do I start? How do I get developers to build and design APIs that are up to the standard of my organization, whether that be a security standard or like what kind of grouping I'm using, what kind of domain model I'm using, what is a good best practice when I'm doing a disruptive operation versus a read-only operation. And we are engaging in a pilot right now with a large global bank that told us pretty much between 85 and 90% of their internal APIs are not up to any standards that their architecture set. Just think about it for a minute, and they have hundreds of it. And the reason this is happening is because there is no easy path for developers to start from a boilerplate, right? If you look at the Spring community, there is something called start.spring.io. It's a super popular starting point for Spring developers with millions of projects starting there every month. And the reason it's so popular, it gives you kind of this easy experience of dealing with the dependencies and getting your scaffold code up and running. We kind of push something similar for the API world that allows developers to start very quickly, but on curated designs, so they can get to those blessed architectures or blessed API structure from the get-go. And they don't just copy paste the first example they found on Google, which happens to be the easiest, but also the furthest away from any corporate standards, right? So that's kind of one thing, how you actually getting started in the right way. The second thing is that if we follow this notion of continuous delivery, we all understand now that you cannot just push code in the path to production and expect it to, compile with something from Docker Hub or from any open source library, right? There's got to be an adult supervision of how you build stuff, how you turn your source into an image. There is nothing like that in an API. There is no equivalent of a build pack, to take kind of the concepts from Cloud Foundry that Tanzu is also adopting with Cloud Native Build Pack that is super popular, this curated template or recipe for changing code into a runtime environment. There is nothing equivalent like a build pack for APIs. That's second item. How do you actually make the API compile in a way? It's not really compilation, but how do you deal with all the calls that it's making, the performance? How do you even test it in the right way? How do you make developers discover it, right? So it's not just about testing. It's about, am I using the right API in the right way? Do I have a portal where I can go and dynamically find what I need? And it's not based on documentation. You actually have the gateway generating the Open API doc for you dynamically, right? So it's all self-service. There is no human that you rely on to make those changes. So does that make sense so far? So like the starting experience, the build experience, if you will, or the delivery experience.
Yeah.
And I think where we see the most amount of disruption is in the role of the gateway itself. And now I'm finally getting to your question. None of this can work if every little change had to go to this giant gateway. And it's not because the change management is bad or IT people are, it's their life mission to slow developers down. It's all about blast radius. If you have one giant gateway, every little change can massively affect the rest of your organization. If the same gateway handles, 5 internal APIs that a team in, I don't know where, is building, at the same as our massive API entry point for our business, they're going to meet the same standards. So the massive big API, okay. The small little one, he's suffering because he's going through all that change management. So there's got to be a different way of architecting this. And what we're suggesting is much more of a federated approach. So you think about not one gateway, but dozens of gateways. And there was this term micro gateway that's sometimes being used. I kind of felt it was used in a different context that is a little bit archaic, but for lack of a better word, let's call it a micro gateway or an app-friendly gateway. And you have many of these. And you can even think about coming back to that large bank that I was referring to. They want to set up a gateway or a micro gateway for every business application. So it's the proxy in front of your microservices. So think about a business application that has 5, 6, 10 microservices behind it. It has a small gateway. And that gateway is where the collaboration starts. So that gateway feeds a hub. That gateway handles all the internal communication between those micro APIs. That gateway can also be the point where you start thinking about the brownfield. How's that business application is accessing external services? External, I mean like third party, not necessarily public services. You have many of those. You may still have, this 1 or 2 giant ones for the public APIs, but you're really separating nicely between your public-facing APIs and your internal APIs, and you're doing it in a federated mode. And why is federated important? Because you have to do 2 things for this to work. You have to make it super developer-friendly, so developers can just change a route, and within a millisecond, that route updates in the gateway. It cannot go through any kind of manual processes. But at the same time, you want to keep this secure, because it's true that there's a statement that you build an internal API, it can become an external API tomorrow morning. I agree with that. You cannot just say the internal APIs are, internal quality forever. So the way we found this could work well is if you separate the life cycle of the gateways from the route change. And that's kind of the third thing we offer in that API grid. It means that your DevSecOps or your DevOps team can manage the instances of the gateways separately from how developers are checking in routes. It's two very separate items. You can think about developers with changing a YAML file, which defines the route, and then there is a separate mapping into a gateway or many gateway instances that applies those routes. And that allows you to do, let's say, security updates to the gateway itself in a separate lifecycle than changing the routes. You can think about routes as part of your code base. Gateway is more part of your application infrastructure. And you can separate those two lifecycles and even have maybe two separate pipelines for them. So does that make sense? So kind of starting, building, federated approach that is very developer-friendly, and at the same time, separation of concerns between the gateway lifecycle or the micro gateway lifecycles and the route lifecycle.
And so as a developer, I don't have to be burdened with the cognitive load of everything a gateway does when it comes to policies, security, all of that, with every iteration that I need to make on my API. And so you mentioned build kit earlier. Is this so an individual API, how I build an API, how it gets discovered, how it gets tested? But is there build kits for the gateway? Say like a new line of business or a new team gets stood up, can they rapidly set up a new gateway and a whole new process really fast and efficiently?
Yes. So when I mentioned many micro gateways, inherently that means that there's got to be an easy way to install them, a standard ways to control them, and a very clean separation between what the gateway does and what the developer needs to worry about. So none of that can be a reality if it takes you a week to install a gateway for every instance. So we spend a lot of work at Tanzu taking the Spring Cloud Gateway open source project, which is a very popular Spring project, and making it commercial grade, of course, but also very easy to install on either Cloud Foundry or Kubernetes, and achieve, so essentially within a few CRDs, you got the gateway up and running. It's nothing more than a Spring Boot app running in the backend. And the engineers are going to kill me. It's a lot more than a Spring Boot app running in the backend. But from a simplicity point of view, it's really, really super easy to do. Like even me, I can run many gateways on on different environments in minutes. It's very, very easy. And you also can achieve high availability in a very simple, just increase the instance count and the gateway takes care of the rest. So the install is greatly simplified. But the second thing that gateway does, it really abstracts the developers to worry only about the things they need. So with Spring Cloud Gateway, which by the way, the name, don't get me started on naming, has nothing to do with Spring. It can support any language as long as it speaks HTTP, right? And it's fully multi-language. We have many customers in production already using like Node frontend, Java backend, .NET. It really doesn't matter. That's one of the beauties of this API world. It abstracts the implementation beautifully. But back to the separation for developers. So with Spring Cloud Gateway, developers don't need to worry about SSO. That's a killer feature everywhere we go. The only thing a developer needs to do is add a tag in their YAML file or their JSON file says SSO true on a route. That's it, true or false. Zero things beyond that from a developer point of view, as simple as it can get. And tying this back to our first example, or to our starting example, we actually make it even that they don't have to say true because we're creating these boilerplate YAMLs for them, where if it's a destructive, it's a disruptive operation, let's say it has to be SSO protected, right? And you can validate that. So even that decision can be ignored. But let's assume at the very least the developer will say this route, true or false, protected. What happens behind the scene is quite interesting. The gateway is responsible for knowing that this route is true. Then it goes and looks for an SSO secret, and then does whatever it needs to do to have like the OpenID connection working. And if it's in the Tanzu application service environment, you can have a dedicated SSO plan for your organization. If it's not, like any OpenID Connect protocol will work, but neither the secret nor the definition or that flow has anything to do with the developers. That's part of the DevOps responsibility when they're setting up the gateway. So there is a very clean, there is nothing in the developer routes that potentially going to be part of your code repo that has anything to do with SSO aside from that SSO true. So very clean separation, very encouraging for developer productivity. And there's other examples like this, like token relay, same story. Filters, if a developer want to do rate limiting, it's very simple filter they apply in their route files. They don't worry about the implementation of that at all. They don't care about the how the gateway is deployed. If it's one instance, many instances, they only interface with the route file. So we make this super easy for developers. We maintain that policy and security on the DevOps side, but even then we are not talking about one giant centralized gateway. We're talking about a federated approach of many gateways, potentially fronting every business app you have.
And so each individual gateway has, I'm assuming, a standard set of policies, standard,
yep.
Everything is that. How does that work in a governance standpoint? Does it then get managed by a central governance group that sets all those policies and defines those all across the gateways?
Yeah, so it's really up to the organization to decide how they want to run it. We see a spectrum of examples of that. There is the ones that think about it from a starting experience, which means that every gateway that is generated in this organization is going to be generated with the exact same policies, YAMLs. It's not even up to the DevOps persona to decide what are the different artifacts of the gateway. So there is no, all gateways are kind of the same in a sense of policies. There is other type of organizations that says the DevOps persona has the freedom to decide how and what to configure in the gateway. And the way you manage all these different instances is you can look at them, for example, with the gateway emits an endpoint for metrics and performance, whether you can consume that with the Tanzu observability or any APM tool. You can think about it as just an app, right? Like I said, it's really just an app. So the way you manage 50 different boot apps is similar to the way you would manage the gateway. Something that is pretty popular that is coming up right now is that we have integration into Tanzu observability or Wavefront, which follows the actuator endpoint from the gateway. And you can aggregate all the gateway into one group or many groups. Let's say this is line of business A, line of business B, and you have those gateways behind them, and you can look at your route performance. So it really makes it's up to you how to manage it in a sense, but it's simple as managing a collection of apps.
But federated gateways allow for federated governance or centralized governance. It's flexible enough.
Correct. So you can absolutely say, I have a federated gateway deployment, but I have a centralized management. You can say, for example, that all the gateways are emitting the route definition into the same gateway portal, API portal. So you have one portal for that you can see all the gateways, and then you have different policies of who can access what. Or you can say, I want an API portal per line of business. So line of business B cannot access APIs of line of business A. But in that case, I think it will be wise to worry about how you can collaborate, right? So maybe they cannot access directly the APIs, but you want us, maybe you treat line of business B like brownfield. So it's an external API from a line of business A point of view, but they can still collaborate. But it's very flexible. It's not dictated by us on how you should do it. And I can tell you from most of the conversation I'm having, when the customer understands that the gateway is not one thing that is sacred and controlled by ops, but something that is much closer to the application and controlled by DevOps, they also buy in much easier into this federated management alongside federated deployment.
It load balances the organizational, the decision making down to the line of business or the DevOps, because I think that's the part that some people are missing with the DevOps is it's not just the technical, it's the decision making, it's the policies. Yep. You want to give teams the ability to make those decisions, but you sometimes still want to centralize how those policies get set, encourage that collaboration and maybe a center of excellence or something where everyone comes together to define those. But this sounds like it trickles down observability all the way down to the developer. So when it comes to the observability, can I, as a developer, see traffic and see and have all that awareness around my routes and understand what's happening?
Absolutely. You can access the routes that you applied into the gateway and see exactly how they perform. You can access, you have different slices and views on how you can see that. You can actually say, I want to have, because the route the apply is nothing more than putting a YAML into the Kubernetes environment and updating a CRD object. You can say, hey, I'm applying these routes. I can see immediately the effect and come back and update, and I can do that in my inner loop or local dev environment and not affect the other live traffic on the gateway between teams. So you can have even different levels of access within the internal APIs. Like my inner loop APIs that I'm just testing, and then before I expose them to other developers. To your point, but I want to build on something you said, which I think is super important. The policy problem is there is no magic solution, in my opinion, once you've centralized everything into one gateway. And gateway is just an example. You said Oracle database. There is many examples like that. Once everything is in one place, you have to slice it and dice it in a very rigorous manual way because the blast radius is huge. Once you separate this and essentially you have different instances of API routes in that case, the policies become much simpler and you can think about the deployment of these gateways as part of your policy. Like who can access what is defined the deployment time of the gateway, and it makes your life super, super easy, which brings us into this notion of brownfield. You want to be able to have developers access third-party APIs or maybe APIs from another line of business as if it was the Spring Boot app next door, right? From a developer point of view, you never want them to worry about networking and access and service mesh and all that. And there is something pretty interesting that I think is valuable from Tanzu. It's that combination between gateway, portal, and service mesh. And what I mean by that is that you can actually create these policies behind the scenes. And if you heard this, there is a notion called global namespaces. You may heard about this. This is a GNS. This is something that we promote a lot from Tanzu service mesh, but I think it's much bigger than just Tanzu. It's like, how do I make the cross-cluster Kubernetes world not a service mess, but a service mesh, right? Like it's so hard today, and it's definitely not developers. I would say it's almost even not DevOps. Like you got to be a very experienced SRE with a lot of K8 knowledge to actually make that happen. And it's not even about just K8. Like what happens if you have VMs and containers running side by side? Like you have a lot of legacy stuff running on VMs. You have new apps running on containers. You gotta manage this better from a load balancing point of view and so on. So there's a set of assets that I think we bring to the table without promoting too much. I'm the furthest you can see from a sales guy, probably. but you have things like AVI load balancer, you have the Tanzu service mesh itself, you have the integration into the gateway, and the fact that the portal can get access to that immediately on the open API. And all of that means that there's a lot of technical mumbo jumbo behind the scene, so the developer will just see it as if it was the Spring Boot next door. So from his or her point of view, it's same experience, but of course you have the strictest policy that you want to restrict that access. And that kind of the balance that I think customers would love to strike between productivity and control.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, first of all, I'm going to talk to your VP marketing leadership, because you need to be in the game. They need to use you to name things, because you've got some of the best names for things. I really think you should be.
Well, I'm good friends with her, so maybe I'll get out of it. But
but from what API Federation at Gateway Federation at the level you described, so as far as the delivery of and building of APIs, it's really flexible, and it fits with domain-driven design and really carving up the organization in meaningful groups and chunks so that you can deliver the most meaningful services and APIs. But I would say what I'm seeing from the front end is, I'm doing a lot of healthcare and finance APIs and standardization when it comes to different countries. So you got data sovereignty, you've got EU regulation when it comes to PSD2, you've got US regulations coming or just happened around the FHIR specification in healthcare. And so this type of federation and policies can really speak to how you carve up your global business in a way that you can serve up external or partner services in a way that is all, coherently policy driven as well. That's pretty powerful.
Yeah, that's totally true. And we talked a lot about internal APIs, but everything we said on the federated approach, like you just mentioned, applied for things you expose externally based on whatever policies you have externally and what data do you want or what access do you want to expose. And another example I'm working with right now in Europe, it's around a utility company that wants to have third parties use their APIs to build like IoT apps or smart apps for energy consumption, but they don't have a clean way of exposing certain APIs into that third parties. So the only option they have is to rebuild these APIs at the engineering level to actually only access the data they need, instead of reusing the internal APIs they already have, just with a federated sliced approach. And the reason is because they only have one giant gateway, and that's the only way to expose those APIs. So that flexibility also gives you, in some cases, prevents the need to rebuild APIs if they're already good enough for your standards, and you just have an access challenge.
Yeah, and what you're exposing in Germany versus what you're exposing in France. Yep. The policies can deal with the regulation, how the data is stored, what's available, what's not. And I just did an episode with Ford, about their fleet management of vehicles and what it's like to manage the data around an IoT device with wheels, when it's rolling down and the road and how it's connected. And so he was talking about the velocity they need to deliver new APIs to take that data. But again, because of regulation, the rules around what data can be collected, what can't be, who has access to that, moves just as fast as the technology. So having a federated gateway approach to all of that by country, by region, by line of business, by whatever the bounded context that makes sense, and having policies that and what you said about the gateway management and the policy management and the build kit for not just the individual APIs, but the actual gateway. I mean, that's kind of like, Legos. Rather than having a big box of Legos, you have the kits, to build the Millennium Falcon or build the different things, and it's ready to go. Because I mean, most engineers I know really aren't engineers. They're just reverse engineers, meaning they only program what they're taught or what they're shown. So having build kits at all levels sounds like a pretty powerful approach to this.
Yeah, that actually goes. I mentioned the starting experience. Internally, it's called the App Accelerator. The power or the effectiveness of these curated templates always, well, it surprised me, but it doesn't surprise me because I was a developer myself. Like 95% of the developers we talk to, they just apply the first example they see in Google, or they just take the code that was built by their friend next door and just reuse it. And that's a bad thing, but it's also a good thing in the sense that if you create the templates easy enough to access. So it's not an architectural committee. I used to run the architectural committee at Yahoo, so I guess I was one of the most hated folks there. But you don't have those gates of manual approvals. It's almost, this is actually not from me, but from a client I spoke to the other day. It's like, oh, I get it. You're giving us CAS. And I'm like, what are you talking about? I just spent 2 hours talking to you about Spring and apps. You're talking to me about CAS and containers. He said, no, not container as a service, curation as a service. Because he understood that this app acceleration gives his architect a power they never had today, up until now. The only way for them to control was to publish a 40-page white paper and hope developers will read it, which they never do, or gate everything on a architectural committee. You got to schedule 6 months in advance because everybody's trying to get the time of those 4 senior architects. What if the output of those architectural committees already this app acceleration templates that every developer can just go into a website, a complete SaaS experience, and get those boilerplate code for them? This was actually in the context of a Spring app, but the exact same principle will apply to what is a good route definition. What is a good way of getting started with kind of a clean way of routing it? And to your example about Europe, it's like even the routes themselves. Sometimes you can expose something in the route signature, and sometimes you can't. And you can have the exact same API for different countries, but it has to look different because it doesn't have the word customer in it or something, right? So even those little stuff are super hard when everything is kind of locked down and the change management is like changing a database schema and not like applying a source change in Git.
Yeah, but these templates, I mean, for developers, so rather than, as you said, they have to go get approval and it takes 6 months to do something, they can take this. It saves them time, saves them energy and headache because everything's there. They can take it, they can run it locally, see how it all works, run it in a container. They can deploy it, play with it, and you could have different templates depending on line of business or depending on country or region. And then all the learning and education is built into the template. So the developers learning, they're never going to read that white paper. You put out the white paper on how to do everything, no one's going to read that, or a few people will, but most developers won't. But if they can get hands-on and play with the template and see how it works, you're teaching them good design, you're teaching them good development practices, you're teaching them all in that one template.
Yeah, and it's self-service, so it's even faster than searching in Google, and it's not ending up as trash code. It's not just that they are never going to read the document. It forces the organization later down the application lifecycle to apply all these manual gates, because you cannot trust the developers that these APIs are ever going to be meeting standards. So now you have another gate of, hey, we have 5,000 internal APIs here. We gotta invest an effort now to realize, like, are they up to code? How are they? Are there best practices? Are they doing what they're supposed to do? So I think it solves a bunch of problems ahead of time.
So this show is designed for leadership, business leadership. We do get down into the technical details as we've shown, but how do you convince leadership, VPs, CXOs to to go all in on APIs and a federated API approach? How do you convince them?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So kind of the fun in my job is I can talk in the same day to a C-level and then to like a hands-on developer, and it's going to be one Zoom after another. So it kind of forces me to think about the high-level pitch, the low-level pitch all the time. Usually what I tell executives is that the world of building modern apps or modern microservices, if you will, is changing, right? Whether you like it or not, the APIs are become a de facto standards of how your teams are going to collaborate. And it's not going to be, national roles type diagrams. It's like, that's the modern contract. And you got to learn to manage it. It's not enough for you to manage and control the few externals that you have, if any. You have to be able to manage those APIs internally. And by manage, it means that have control, but don't kill the productivity. Because it's very easy to put these gateways and just say, make them a hardcore gateway, right? Like everything is manually approved. But it's a very slippery slope from that to completely killing your innovation. So there has to be kind of as an executive, you got to think about this middle ground or this happy path of how do I keep my developers productive and still helping them collaborate and use those APIs as a way to save time, save bugs because they can reuse stuff other people already built, and managed it in a way that controls my meet my standards. And the thing about federated is federated looks very scary until you understand the blast radius concept. So even with executive, I tell them, just think about this way. We're not suggesting put everything in one basket, but make the basket less secure. We're suggesting like start separating the basket into mini baskets, and the separation of concerns takes a lot of kind of the headache of controlling it. And when you couple it with a better starting experience or with a curated starting experience, that looks much less scary than it was in the start. The challenge, I think, as an industry, and James Waters talks about it a lot if you interview him, it's like, in a sense, the API industry got everything backwards, right? We started from the operational experience and gated everything, and we completely forgot about the developers. So now when you go, and it's even hard to have an API conversation without dev. That's crazy, right? Usually when you talk about API platforms, you find on the other side of the Zoom the VP of Ops. What do you care about APIs? Oh, because I'm responsible. Nobody touch my Apogee. I'll kill you if you touch my Apogee. How many developers are actually changing APIs here? I don't know. They're probably too scared of me to even think about it. So, right. So that's kind of the hard part of the conversation about the perception of APIs as an app dev thing and not as an ops thing. So it's kind of the challenges we see out there.
Yeah, I mean, this really reflects. So I just went through the Gartner Magic Quadrant process, and Postman, we have 15 million developers. We're an HTTP client. We're an API client. That's where we've made developers' lives easier. But over the last few years, we've become a full lifecycle API management solution, to use Gartner terms. But we consider ourselves an API platform, and our relationship with the developer is what you just described. But we really strongly believe in both sides of the relationship, and I really feel like that's the area where Gartner needs to spend more time. Is, I don't know if it's been Apogee, Mastery, and MuleSoft wagging Gartner or vice versa, but they're very provider focused. It's API gateways, management, and then they have one section where they go, what sort of consumer stuff do you do? They ask just one section like about developers, and but it's a big long document about everything API provider side. So it's a very one-sided. I feel like the last decade, coming out of the service-oriented architecture world, it's gotten better, because it's APIs and it's using more of the web, but it's still very provider heavy. Where, as you said, the developers and the DevOps and the agency and autonomy and them being able to move fast. This is why APIs happen, in my opinion, is the service-oriented architecture laboratory, enterprise laboratory. APIs kind of jumped out of the petri dish and started growing because it allowed tech companies to move faster and do things quicker when it comes to mobile. So I think your description of that relationship and how it's got to evolve at the gateway level in a federated way is pretty important.
Yeah, and I totally agree with you. This frustrates me every time I read these reports. It's not just, and I won't get into the why. I can guess that your guess is very accurate, but let's leave it at that. But it's not only provider focused; it's infrastructure up focused. So the reader, like what I would tell Gartner is like, hey guys, like, why would an app dev lead ever read your API report? Like, doesn't that sound a bit dumb to you? We're talking about APIs here. You have application in the freaking acronym. But I don't think anyone, an app dev, will spend the time reading this document because it talks all about how you stand up the mechanics of APIs that he or she shouldn't care about at all, right? So it's all backwards. But that's what's kind of gives you and I some fun stuff to do. I think we can change. There is a big disruption going on, and we haven't even started talking about the app modernization. I think that's the early but biggest wave when more and more organizations will realize the rewrite approach doesn't work. And there's got to be a way to keep the lights on the old stuff and a smarter way of connecting the new experience. And what app modernization is really about is creating new experiences greenfield, connecting to existing backend system with a brownfield API, not rewriting those backend systems.
So this is how we make brownfield development more attractive and sexy, so people aren't just focusing on the greenfield.
Well, I would argue there is no such thing as a greenfield development in an enterprise. There is no way to build a real enterprise app without touching some of your backend systems, right? Yeah. Otherwise, you go work at a startup, build something on AWS. You don't have to. Where's the value for an enterprise? You got to connect to something that already exists in the majority of the cases. The question is how you do that effectively, and we already see patterns that comes from the external API worlds, like rate limiting. I'm working with a customer now that adopted this brownfield API approach to one of their legacy environment, and they put an API proxy in front of it. And that was all great, and they were proud of themselves. But it turns out the clients are bringing down the legacy JE app 4 times a week because the request rate is too high. So, hey, what you're using Spring Cloud Gateway already. You have a route file. Just use the a rate limit route. And it turns out that's all they had to do. It had zero effect on the app because the app never got to that request rate that they actually needed or they consumed. It was more about the number of clients accessing simultaneously. And then, it turned out from, hey, we got to hire Accenture for an emergency 6 months project to rewrite this JE monolith to, 34 seconds of adding rate limits in an API route. Just, it's just kind of an anecdotal example, but you can think about these patterns are much that for you start thinking about the modernization of an enterprise environment, and you agree to or align with the fact you need a better approach than rewrites, then that could be interesting.
A lot of folks are afraid of public APIs and everything that goes with them because they're public and it's very risky and scary. But do you feel like that kind of adoption of some of these practices from public APIs, but bringing them internally, would help us make our APIs more mature and ready to be public?
Yeah, I think the more when we talked about internal APIs can become external at any second, the idea behind it is that if you dramatically improve the way you start, control, and deploy internal APIs and the way you make your developers more productive, because similar to the fact that the IT ops guys are not bad people for gating everything, developers are not bad people for taking the first example they see in Google, whether that's secure or not, because they want to be productive. They're sick of waiting for these architectural committees. So both sides have good intentions, but the process kind of kills it on both ends. So if you get developers a much easier starting experience, get things curated and built in a much more automated way, your internal APIs are guaranteed to become a much higher quality, almost in a way that you can reduce, not take off, but reduce the kind of, what's the word, the scare factor of exposing things externally. Because the nice thing about the federated approach is conceptually the gateway doesn't care if it's external or internal. It's just what kind of ingress rule do you add to it, right? So if it works well on the internal API conceptually, again, I'm not saying put an Nginx now on every gateway and boom. But conceptually I'm saying, if the APIs, internal APIs, are up to code and up to standard and are much more in control, the switch to exposing some of them externally is going to be much simpler than it is today.
Yeah. Wow. We could go on forever, but I think we're hitting the hour here. But I kind of feel like I'm going to have you back to explore some of these other topics.
Oh, and I'd love to do a demo for you at some point to your audience. Like, yeah, there's this API grid demo I'm running with customers, showing some of the Tanzu concepts and how that becomes easier. We can do that. And I think, yeah, this your audience are kind of the I think the reason we are. It's almost like I need to apologize to your audience for what we've done with APIs so far.
I want to keep pushing. I'm going to get other API management providers. I'm going to get MuleSoft folks and Apogee folks and Kong and other folks to step up to the table and answer some of the same questions that we discussed. And so I would love to start figuring out some other sessions that involve, all right, show, what's different about API management today. And then I don't think, as you said, we didn't spend enough time talking about, the modernization and digital transformation and what's coming next, So I would love to get you back for more of that, but sure, we just got to figure out the right format. So, well, thank you. I appreciate your time today. This has been great. Very, very exciting conversation, and look forward to talking more in the future.
Awesome. Glad you enjoy it, and I gotta go. Thanks my dogs for not barking. So that was a surprise. I hope they're okay, because it's not a usual thing with them.
It's understand. My dog's laying here right here, but she's sound asleep. She doesn't care. So
you gotta teach me how to do that.
Yeah, she hears this all day, every day, API, blah, blah, blah. So she's pretty used to it. But anyways, have a good day, Dekel. Thank you.
Thank you very much.